Planning is one of the most important things in chess. You formulate short-term and long-term plans. It will help you play better. I hope these examples that we went through in this segment will help you do better formulating plans and have better results. Good luck!
Hi, my name is Paul Trung. Welcome to Winning Chess the Easy Way. In today's segment, we're going to discuss about planning in chess. As you know, chess has three parts: opening, middle game, and endgame. And in order to be a better player, you need to learn how to make efficient plans according to the position in all three stages of the game. As a famous saying by a grandmaster, chess is something you don't memorize, chess is something you understand. And now Susan will try to go through step by step and show you how to make plans in all three parts of the game. Susan?
Thank you, Paul. Welcome to Winning Chess the Easy Way. As Paul said, we will talk in this segment about planning in chess. Just like in regular life, you have short-term plans and long-term plans, right? In your everyday life, you have errands to run, things to take care of today. And then you have long-term plan, like, let's say, saving for a house to buy. It's the same way in chess. You have immediate plans to occupy a certain square or attack something. And then you have long-term plans that may range from 8, 10, sometimes 20, 30 moves deep. We will talk about different plans in the opening, which are usually very long-term plans. In the endgame, that may be very short-term plans or long-term plans. And the toughest part, the middle game. Sit back, enjoy, and learn. In the first part of this segment, we will talk about opening planning. Just like that comes first, right? We start right here in the beginning position. The first example, I will talk about a certain position in the King's Indian defense. Let's see how that position comes. d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7. This is the King's Indian defense. e4, d6, knight f3, black castles, bishop e2. Both sides are so far developing in a very normal way. e5, which is a standard move in this position, white castles, black plays knight c6, putting more pressure on the d4 square, and white closes the position up with d5, and knight moves to e7. So this is the first position I would like to discuss and share with you what are the plans for both sides. It's a normal position. I cannot say who is better. Maybe white is a little bit better, but it's certainly fight ahead. White's plan is very clear. The idea is to break through with c5, open up the c file, let's say with the bishop coming here and the rook to c1, get a knight here, and try to enter through the c7 square. That may involve on the way attacking the pawn on a7, and in case black makes that move, then the b6 square often gets weakened. So what happens is the knight is able to get in here, or sometimes with the help of the queen, the bishop gets to b6 after black weakens that square by playing e6. That is white's general plan in this position. Sometimes white chooses to play b4 to help that, to play c5. Another common plan is to play knight e1, knight d3, to also help the same push with c5. But the general plan is the same. White wants to open the c file, so the rook and maybe the queen and maybe the knight can get through there into black's position. Now, at the same go, black will not just sit back and wait until white does all of that. Black's plan is to get this knight out of the way, usually through h5 or sometimes e8 or d7, depending on what white's next move is. And then to play f5. That is a typical plan for black. And try to develop an attack on the king's side against white's king. For example, one typical way it could go: knight e1, knight d7, that at the same time that it prepares f7, f5, it also blocks for now the c5 square, knight d3, and then f5. That's a typical plan for black. And for example, in variations when white plays now or later f3, black's idea is to get the knight back, followed by closing the position with f4, followed by g5, preparing an advance with h5 and g4. And black would bring, let's say, the knight over, move the king out of the way, and the bishop here or here, and get maybe the queen also involved. So in nutshells, this is black's plan to develop an attack on the king's side. Sometimes it involves rather putting pressure on the e4 pawn here, and the pawn structure becomes as such. But most of the time the game develops with this type of pawn structure. So in general, these are the plans in this position. White is playing on the queen's side, trying to open a file and gain material on that side of the board, while black is trying to checkmate white. It's a race that right now, according to today's standing of theory, white has a tiny little advantage. But it's an interesting fight. It's a fun game to play with both sides. Our next opening will be the Meran defense. Let's see how that happens. d4, d5, c4, c6. This is the Slav defense. Knight c3, knight f6, e3, e6, knight f3, knight bd7. This is the starting position of the Meran. White plays bishop d3, that's the main move. Black captures on c4, bishop captures back, and black plays b5, when white bishop retreats usually to d3. This is the starting position that I want to discuss, what the plans are here for both sides. Well, this is one of the most popular openings nowadays. Black is doing pretty comfortable, usually manages to equalize. The main plan here for black is to activate this bishop. He can do that by two means. The most common one is to play a6, either now or first playing bishop b7 and then followed by c5. That is black's plan, to solve the problem of this bishop. Another plan black sometimes tries to do, play bishop d6 and then answer e4 with e5. And then the bishop could also play along the c8, h3 diagonal. White's plan usually involves trying to get ahead in the center. Let's say after a6, e4, c5, and now white can choose whether to play d5 or to play e5. These games usually lead to very sharp tactical games and tense middle game positions. White is trying to play in the center, while black is trying to get counterplay from the side. Our next example is the stone wall, the famous stone wall. That starts like this. d4, f5, the Dutch defense. c4, knight f6, knight f3, e6, g3, d5, bishop g2, c6, white castles, and bishop d6. This pawn formation of pawn on c6, d5, e6, f5, this is what we call the stone wall pawn formation. Well, black became active, as we can say, by playing f5. However, the price is weakening the e5 square. So usually from white's perspective, white has two plans. One, to try to have a knight get in there on e5, preferably after trading the dark squared bishops. Even some people like to trade the bishop here, allowing this trade that ruins white's pawn structure. Others prefer to do this plan, b3 and bishop a3. Of course, black can prevent that for now, but then passively white can prepare that plan and still try to trade the bishops. Another plan white can do, either in conjunction with fighting for the e5 square is to try to play f3 and e5 soon. Usually the knights make kind of some funny knight maneuvers. For example, this knight comes here, this knight comes back, this knight comes here, and this knight comes here. That's the ideal setup for the knight to control both the e5 square. For example, of course, this needs to be defended first, but then the idea is to trade the bishop without ruining the pawn structure on the king's side. So they can be traded, and then the knight can get back. And then the dream is to get a knight to e5, and eventually to prepare an f3, e4 breakthrough, of course, with the support of the rook. Well, of course, black doesn't have to sit and wait and allow all of this so easily. And usually black tries to develop an attack. But before we got to that, I want to say the other plan for white. The other plan for white is usually also after trying to fight for the e5 square, to try to get a pawn advance on the queen's side, opening the b file, and then coming in. We will see an example like that later on this tape when we talk about middle game plans. So black's plan usually is to simply castle and then often get the queen around here. Even the bishop sometimes gets out this kind of interesting route. And often black starts an attack on the king's side against the white king and just simply try to advance all the pieces. Of course, the knight also comes to help, and the bishop can come, and something of this sort is what black is planning. Objectively speaking, we consider a slight advantage for white in this opening, but it's a steady long-term advantage. However, white needs to be cautious because the attack can get dangerous if white makes some mistakes. Another plan that black has to his disposal, after castling of course, to develop the bishop with b6 and bishop b7. That's by far less dangerous for white. It's more solid for black, but it's less dangerous for white because the bishop is useful to help the attack on this side of the board or even remaining on c8. After b6 and bishop b7, black is just trying to kind of hang on to the position and play a more normal, solid game like this. So the bottom line for white is white should aim to fight for the weak e5 square and to try to trade the dark squared bishops. Our next example is the Queen's Gambit Carlsbad variation. Starts like this: d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, knight f6, and now white trades quickly on d5. Pawn takes back, bishop develops to g5, bishop e7, e3, castle, bishop d3, c6, queen c2, knight d7, knight f3, rook e8, castle, and knight to f8. This position can happen from many different move orders, but basically this is a very typical position with the Carlsbad pawn structure, as you can see. Here, the typical plan for white is to develop a minority attack. What do we mean by that? We mean that white has only 2 pawns, meaning less pawns than black has on the queen's side, and yet the minority, the 2 pawns, are trying to attack the 3, which is very uncommon in chess, because normally we like to attack or initiate play where we are stronger. This is an exception from that common rule. Here white's normal plan is to play rook b1 to prepare b4 and b5. What is that good for? Once the pawn would get to b5, black has to choose between 3 choices. Either to capture, in which case white can capture back with one of the pieces depending on the exact position at the time. And then black will have a weak isolated pawn on d5 that white can try to attack. Or black can push the pawns through, in which case white will get to trade these pawns, and play again against the isolated pawn, this time on the half open file, so the rook can even attack easier. And finally, if black ignores and just leaves the pawn there, white will capture, and again we'll have a target in the c6 pawn that's exposed on a half open file that white can attack with the rook and the queen from the side. And now white plays on the b file and on the c file, and the c5 square is also weak, where ideally a knight can jump in eventually. That is white's plan in usual. Black, for example, after rook b1 can try to play knight e4. That's one of the typical black plans in this opening, when white has to be careful. White cannot capture, let's say, knight takes e4, because would lose a piece right away after pawn takes, and now either bishop takes pawn, black wins a piece with bishop g5, or after bishop e7, queen e7, white is stuck in a fork for the knight and the bishop. However, white has to trade the bishops on e7 after knight e4, when the queen takes back. Black's plan should be to try to develop an attack on this side by getting the bishop here and the knight here, and so on. Another idea for black to keep in mind is trying to stop the b4 b5 plan, depending on the exact situation, to play b5 with the idea to implant a knight on c4. If black is not able to accomplish that, to get a knight to c4, it's usually not a good thing, because the c6 pawn becomes weak and it's easy to attack. However, if black manages to get a knight to c4, that often works out very well for black. So what's the bottom line? If we go back to this pawn structure, really, I don't want to talk about this specific position, because here there are many different moves to play, but the plans are pretty much like this. White is trying to advance b4 b5, while black is trying to combine putting a stop on white's aggression on the queen's side, at the same time trying to create counterplay on the king's side by attacking with his pieces, not with his pawns. Now we shall talk about a couple of king pawn openings. Let's start with the first one, the Ray Lopez exchange variation. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, a6, bishop takes knight, pawn takes. This used to be at one time Bobby Fischer's favorite. Castles and f6. What are the plans in this type of pawn structure? We really define in many positions the plans according to the pawn structures. So try to remember ideas according to that, not by exact positions. Here white plays d4 to trade the pawns, and white's overall plan is to use this pawn majority. You see white has here 4 pawns versus 3, and while black has 4 versus 3 here, but it's not the same, because the c pawns are doubled up. So imagine that all the pieces from the board are gone, except the pawns and the kings. White is in a winning position. So therefore white's aim is to try to trade as many pieces as possible. However, black has one compensation, and namely that he has his pair of bishops, while white gave up one bishop already for a knight. So one thing you should remember as black, definitely make sure don't trade off your bishops, for a knight especially. Black has to try to mobilize his pawns on the queen's side while there are still pieces on the board, because once they are gone, the 3 pawns here can stop the 4 here, while the 4 here versus the 3 on the king's side are able to create a passed pawn eventually in an endgame. Next we'll talk about the isolated pawn structure, and we'll see a French defense to get to there. e4, e6, d4, d5, knight d2, c5. These are one of the popular choices. Another one would be knight to f6, leading to totally different type of games. This was a favorite of Viktor Korchnoi that he played many times against Anatoly Karpov in their World Championship match series. Knight f3, knight c6, pawn takes back, bishop b5, bishop d6. As you can notice here, just like in the Meran opening that we saw earlier, white here is waiting until the bishop gets out and only now trades the pawn, so black can waste a move capturing back. Castle, knight g7, and knight b3 attacking the bishop, and bishop returns to d6. Basically, in this type of position, where black has an isolated pawn, white's plan is very clear. Try to block it. Usually white plays a move like c3, maybe after developing the bishop first, let's say, and castle, and then plays move like c3 and tries to block it, and eventually tries to get pieces out and attack this pawn. Every trade of piece usually helps white, in this case, to play against the isolated pawn. Black is better off avoiding trading pieces and trying to create counterplay, just like with the minority attack in the Carlsbad variation in the Queen's Gambit that we saw a little earlier. Black should get the pieces out and try to get some kind of counterplay against white's king on the king's side. In the meantime, keeping the balance in the center. White's dream is to get all the pieces basically off the board except the rooks. And for example, dream about a position like this. It seems that black can hold on to that pawn, but not so simple, because white could use the pin always eventually. So that's the long-term plan that white is looking at, if he wasn't able to win the pawn by other ways earlier. So that's the long-term plan, even thinking about the endgame right from the opening. So black has to be cautious not to get into a passive position when all he can do is just sit and defend the pawn. That's why I try to create counterplay. In our initial position in the French that we saw with the isolated pawn, it's a matter of taste. Some people like to play with the isolated pawn, others like to play against it. So it's up to you if you prefer to play positionally against a weak pawn and maybe needing to defend at some point, or you prefer attacking and don't mind having a positional weakness. And last but not least, I want to show you a typical dragon variation in the Sicilian. e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, pawn takes, knight takes, knight f6, knight c3, and g6. This is called the dragon variation that leads to extremely sharp game. Bishop e3, bishop e7, f3, castle, queen d2, knight c6, bishop c4, and white castles to the opposite side than black did, knight e5 and bishop b3. This is a typical basic starting position of the dragon variation. Here the plans are very, very clear. White usually starts a storm with an attack on the king's side, often sacrificing a pawn or two in order to open the h file. And the idea is to develop an attack straight against the king. Just in a nutshell, you'd like to take here, trade the pawns, and come and checkmate. That's the general plan. Of course, things do not work that simply. In reality, black has a choice of allowing h5 or stopping h5. When black stops it, white usually goes and sacrifices with g4 a pawn in order to open files. Black, in the meantime, since it's black's to move in this position, usually creates counterplay on the other side. That involves bringing the rook here or getting the queen out first and the other rook here, and to play knight c4. This bishop often can become very, very powerful, and there are a lot of tactics involved. Sometimes black gets b5, b4 to chase this knight away. This is very, very tactical. If you're interested and you like this position, I recommend get a book or DVD on the subject and get more familiar with it. But it's very, very sharp and tactical. Another typical thing in this opening is that black sacrifices an exchange. Of course, only in situations when white can capture back with the pawn, not like here when the queen could also capture. And this is often a long-term sacrifice, not for any immediate gain. Sometimes, yes, it's for right away checkmate or gaining material, but very often black just gives it up in order to weaken squares around the white king. There are some great examples that black did that very successfully. It depends, however, on the exact position when it's good. However, the idea is very typical for this opening. As we saw in the opening, there are a lot of long-term plans. Because we're just in the beginning of the game, we have to plan ahead, and the game usually lasts 30, 40, 50 moves or more. So naturally, you have to think long-term, besides the short-term small plans along the way. However, in the endgame, plans sometimes are very, very short, because we're close to the end of the game. A good plan may end the game altogether. On the other hand, endgames are a tricky thing. Certain endgames involve 20, 30 move deep plans that are very hard to understand and comprehend. There are some positions when the computer would tell you, checkmate in 58 moves, and it's very hard to figure out for a human why. I'm not gonna bore you with those. I'd rather show you some simpler plans in the endgame. Our first position is a pawn endgame. What is the game plan in this position? Well, the plan is to sacrifice the H pawn to lure the king away from the defense of the other side. And then, while black is busy with that, we walk over and pick up like berries one pawn at a time. Let's see how this works out in a real variation. White pushes the pawn to H6, threatening to promote the pawn. Therefore, black has no choice but to run and catch the pawn. Now, the king moves up to E4. Black goes to pick up the pawn, but that allows white to get through and get to the black pawns. Takes king D6, C5, and king C6, king G6, and picking the pawns up one by one. It wouldn't help black if black would have played in this position, let's say B5, trying to trade the pawns off, because the white king goes to D4, king G6, king C5, king takes, pawn takes, king comes, king B6, king F6, takes, and the white king makes it just on time, cutting out the black king. By the way, if the black king would reach the C8 square in time, it would be a draw. But in this case, white came first, not allowing the black king to come there, and nobody can stop now the A pawn. For example, A5 would be a big mistake, spoiling the game to a draw, allowing king C8. And then the king simply walks under the pawn, and white can do nothing better than stalemate. So very important, remember, king B7 in this position. So, what did we learn in this endgame? We'll use one pawn as a bait to get the king away, while we can go to the other side with the king to pick up the opponent's pawns. One of the most important things in chess is to determine what are the strengths and weaknesses in your position and in your opponent. In our next example, we're having a knight versus bishop endgame. And the first thing we need to do to determine what is the weakness in black's position. In this position that we see, we can determine black's weakness being the pawn on A7, besides the hole on D5, where a knight could sit nicely, or potentially a king walks through. However, here the important factor is the weakness of the A7 pawn, that white can actually attack. So the plan is given. We have the target, just get to it. And the solution is simple. Knight moves to c3, and black cannot reach in time to protect the pawn after knight b5. So this is a simple, immediate, short-term plan. Now we are seeing a bishop endgame where white has an extra pawn. What should be the plan here? Well, eventually to checkmate. Before that, maybe promote a pawn. However, how do we get there? One plan would be to simply walk up with our king and try to chase the bishop away. And when a pawn moves, the bishop would need to take the pawn, and we do this. However, the king is a little bit far away, so the black king may stop us from getting there. The simplest plan here is to try to exchange the bishops. And we can do that by playing king e2, king b7, king d3, king c6, and just on time, bishop d4. That's the simplest way to promote our pawn, because now black has to choose either trading bishops when the black king stays too far from the white pawn to catch, or moving the bishop away, let's say to f8, when we can just push the pawn, take, and gain the bishop, and this is a simple win from here on. As they say, 50% of all endgames are rook endgames. And this is a very typical, important rook endgame, so pay attention how to win here. Things look very easy since white has 2 extra pawns, but it's not as easy as it seems. Let's see what's the difficulty. White would like to promote the a pawn, but his own rook is protecting it, is in front of it. The problem is if we move the rook out to promote the pawn next, we lose our pawn by the rook capturing it. Therefore, we need some help. Let's try the obvious, bringing the king to help. Let's say black just sits and waits. King comes to help, black sits and waits, and the king gets here, protecting the pawn. Now, white is threatening already to get the rook out, the pawn is protected, and then promote the pawn to a queen. However, when white does that, white just keeps getting checks, check, and check, and then let's say the rook goes right back behind the pawn, and the rook is stuck again, cannot get out. So what to do? We are starting right in this position. How to win this position? Now, I have to tell you a secret. If this pawn was here or here, white cannot win. Believe it or not, even though having 2 extra pawns, because white cannot make any progress. When the king gets next to the pawn, a check comes. When the king gets away, the rook can simply go back behind the pawn. Let's imagine the pawn was on g2, and white advances the pawn. Now black just sits and waits, and white pushes the pawn, and black sits and waits, and white pushes the pawn. Now, the trick is, if the king takes, white manages to get that important tempo that the rook can escape by giving a check. And when the king gets out of the check, the pawn can promote and win. However, the problem is that black is not forced to take this pawn at all. Black will continue to sit and wait, and white can make no progress. The same happens if white would have an h pawn. The pawn can advance all the way to h6, but again, black is not forced to take and allow the escape of the rook with a check. However, will just step right under the pawn, and the game is a theoretical draw. However, on the other hand, when we have an f pawn, the situation is different, and you will see now how. So, what's the plan in this position? The plan is to force this king out of one of these 2 squares, because as long as the king is able to stay in one of these 2 squares, white cannot make a progress. So, white's starting move is f4. Let's say black sits and waits, white plays f5, black sits and waits, and white plays f6. Now, we already know what would happen if the king captures the pawn. The rook gets out with a check and then promotes the pawn. If the king stays on h7, we have too many pawns that are about to promote. However, what happens if the king stays on f7? Now the rook cannot get out with a check because we just take the rook. However, here is another very typical motif that you need to remember in this type of endgames, and that is that the rook gets out to h8, threatening the advance of the pawn to become a queen, and when the rook captures the seemingly free pawn, a check comes from the side, making a skewer and winning the black rook. Our last position in our endgame segment is a queen endgame. Queen endgames are famous for the danger of getting perpetual checks. Queens can give a lot of checks, especially with few pawns on the board. If we look at our current position, black is a pawn ahead, so it seems that black is the one actually going for a win. However, white has a dangerous pass pawn. In the meantime, the black king is far away from this pawn, so if we can imagine that the two queens are off the board, white would win easily because the pawn would promote quickly. However, in the meantime, the queens are on the board. So I suggest take a moment, try to figure out what should white do. Is there a way white could force the exchange of the queens? If you take a moment, I'm sure you can figure out. White can force the black king on the same line as the black queen is on by giving the check and then pinning the black queen, and the black queen has no escape. The queens will be traded and the black king is far too far to catch the pawn on the a file. After seeing some examples of plans in the opening and in the endgame, now we will see different examples from middle game positions. This position is from a game of mine that I played in 1981 at the World Championship versus my British opponent, Theresa Needham.
Susan, as I'm looking at this position right now, generally, both sides have equal material. White has a little bit less space, in the board, but black has a double pawn. On the other hand, black has a pair bishop. So some people might analyze this position and say it's maybe a little bit better for black, but somewhat equal. So as you were playing this game, what was in your mind, and what plan did you come up with, and how did you come up with these plans?
Well, in this position, white has a very strong point on d5, a knight that kind of paralyzes a good part of my side of the board. I, however, noticed that the strong point could be for me the g file. So therefore, I wanted to get my rook there, at least one of them, as soon as possible. In the meantime, the first idea I had was to try to play f3 in this position, trying to sacrifice a pawn, because if the pawn takes, that would open up white's king's position. So after I play king h8 and rook g8, the white king could get in more danger. However, it has a problem. The queen can also take, and after the seemingly good bishop g4 move, queen moves to g3, and I cannot take the rook on d1 because of the fork with knight f6, as the queen is pinning the black bishop. That is why I decided with the immediate king h8, freeing space for my rook on g8. At this point already, I'm planning to play f3, because in the previous variation there would be no pin over my bishop on g7. That is why my opponent played h3 now, to guard the g4 square. I continued, putting my rook on the g file just as planned. My opponent got scared being on the g file and therefore moved the king out of the g file to h2. And here I played knight e7, trying to get my knight also to the other side. I didn't mind the trade. In fact, my opponent was better off getting his knight c2 to b4. But she traded on e7, and now I'm getting my queen also towards the king's side, the g or h files. My opponent played knight b4, going after my queen side pawns, but I decided at this point go for all or nothing and attack on the king's side. The queen got to h4, sacrificing my pawn on a6, and now my rook is under attack on b8. But again, I did not waste time moving my rook, but played bishop to h6, opening the g file for my rook. Here my opponent did not take the rook. However, I'd like to show you what I plan to do if she would have taken the rook. Then I would take with rook takes g2, and after king takes, queen takes h3. The king has to move out to g1, and now f3, attacking the queen and threatening checkmate on g2. Now when queen goes to f1, queen g4 check comes, king h1, and bishop f4. And it's quite amazing that despite white being 2 rooks up, they have no defense against the upcoming threat of queen h4 and queen h2 checkmate. Queen g1 would stop kind of that threat by guarding the h2 square, however, would lock in the king to the h1 square, and after queen h4, the king has again nowhere to go. Going back to the position where my opponent could take the rook but did not take it, my opponent played in this position her rook to h1. And here came the final move of the game. Bishop h3, and my opponent resigned because after pawn takes bishop, I'm able to clear the f4 square for my bishop and then checkmate within a move or two. What was the winning plan in this game? Recognizing where is the weakness in the opponent's position, which was the king and the g file that was half open. So the plan was clear. I had to move my king aside and get my rook there. And then, of course, my strongest piece, the queen. My pieces worked together nicely, created a strong attack, and with a final combination, that's how I won the game. The next position is another game of mine that I played in San Francisco in 1986 against the Filipino player Chris Ramarat. I had the white pieces and played a4 in this position.
Susan, in this position, isn't it normal that when you have your king castle on one side, you tend not to open up, the pawns in front of your king?
That's right, Paul. Normally, that's not a good thing to do. However, this is an exceptional situation. And the reason for that is that the position is totally closed. If you look at the pawns in the C, D, E, F files, they are all blocked in each other. So therefore, it's almost impossible that the position would open up anytime soon. And the black queen, or knight, or bishop, or rook could get to the white king. Therefore, it's completely safe. Now, what is my plan? My plan is either to win the pawn on b5, or what happened in the game, my opponent took the pawn on a4. I played rook a1, and my idea is simply double up against the a6 pawn after capturing the black pawn on a4. My opponent played g4, and now simply rook a4, rook g7, and rook h to a1, and black's pawn on a6 is lost. The next game I played against the world-class grandmaster Ljubomir Ljubojevic from Yugoslavia, back in 1987 in Spain.
Well, in this position, white has clearly space advantage. White has a pair of bishops, while black has a little bit of a target on the e4 pawn, but the overall evaluation is white is better. However, what came through your mind at this time, and how did you formulate a winning plan, and what is it?
Well, I certainly felt very comfortable with my position because I can protect my pawn on e4. However, at the same time, I understood that I need to do something more to make progress, to create another weakness in my opponent's camp. So that's my next target, my next plan, how to create a weakness in my opponent's position. And that's how I came up with the plan, playing h4, this move. The plan is to play h5 and h6 in order to force the g pawn to move or disappear from there. My opponent has no really useful moves, so he was just sitting and waiting. Played king h8. Now I got my bishop into the game as well, so h4 helped that as well, freeing the h3 square for my bishop. I attacked the rook retreated to e7, and now I continue with my plan, playing h5. Came rook f7, and the bishop went to f5. Now there is a cute trick I'm threatening with, namely to skewer up black's rooks by playing bishop g6, because black cannot accept the sacrifice, because that would open up the h file and my queen would come in to checkmate with queen h5 and h7. Of course, my opponent noticed that and moved his rook away to d8, so they will not be on the same diagonal. At this point we both had little time on the clock, so we made several moves that are kind of holding the position without making much progress before I continued to follow up the attack. Rook d1, bishop e7. So my next plan is to put a rook on the h file. Rook e2, rook f8, and rook h2. Rook f to e8. I went back to d2 and knight d7. After knight d7, I made another waiting move, bishop b2, to get closer to the time control, as in those times we had to make 40 moves in 2 hours. And the knight moved to f8, trying to come for the help defense of the black king. And now was the moment where I played h6, sacrificing my pawn. Of course, it's not a long-term sacrifice, because after pawn would take the h6 pawn, my queen could come right away and get it back quickly. My opponent chose to keep the position closed in front of his king by playing g6. I played back bishop h3, king g8. Okay, so I managed to get the g7 pawn to move, and now the next task is get the f pawn out of the way, and then I could double up my bishop and queen on the same diagonal and try to checkmate. Here is how I accomplished this goal. g4. You may say that, wow, how can you open up your king like that, moving all your pawns in front of the king? But as you can see, all the black pieces are stuck in the last 2 rows of the chessboard, so they're very far from even getting close to attack my king. In the meantime, I have all my pieces kind of ready to defend my king. My opponent played knight e6, when g5 came with a discover attack on the black knight, and the knight had to move again, and now I won a pawn, bishop f8, and now, despite that I'm a pawn up, I'm more than happy and willing and wanting to give it up, and that's what I did. Played f7, because remember, the goal was to open up the diagonal, so after I can get my queen to c3 and to checkmate. For example, if the queen would capture my pawn now, I would play queen c3 with the idea to checkmate right in the corner. My opponent captured the pawn with his king, and then now I want to open more file, the f file against his king. King went back to g8, I took on g6, took back, and now the queen comes to the diagonal from f6, threatening the pawn on g6 as well as queen h8. The queen came to protect both, but the rook comes to help, and now black is helpless. Black resigned. There is a funny story connected to this game. Back when this game was played in 1987, there were less women playing chess and less women playing chess well. So before the tournament, when my opponent heard that I will be invited to this tournament, as well as former world champion Mayachi Burdanidze, he said, "How can women be invited for a serious tournament?" Well, the organizers listened to him, but nevertheless invited both of us. And after the tournament, if you look at the score table, we both won against him. So that was kind of a funny revenge to his comment. The next game is another game of mine that I played in Spain in 1991 against the Yugoslav international master Paunovic.
Yes, Susan, as I look at this position, I see that white's pieces are pretty much centralized, while black has a problem with the bishop pair having very limited mobility, and the knights are one all the way in the back rank and one on the side. So, of course, white has a space advantage and have a better position. But black's position really have no weakness, so how do you come up with a plan to break through something like that to win the game?
Actually, this position reminds me of one of the opening positions we were discussing at the very beginning, the King's Indian one, just like this game is from a King's Indian defense. White's plan is similar to that. White wants to open up the queen side for his rooks or other pieces. In the meantime, black's plan should be to play f5, like we mentioned there. Let's see how it worked out here. My immediate plan is to try to trade the a pawn for the b pawn, and after that aim for the c6 square with my knight. Let's see how this worked out in the actual game. I proceeded with knight to b4, getting my knight ready there, and now my opponent played queen to b6. Before we continue with the game, I just would like to point out to you a tactical idea that why black cannot easily play f5 in this position. Because after I would capture the pawn on f5, the pawn cannot take back because the knight is hanging, the queen can just capture it. And after bishop f5, my answer would be forking with g4. So for now, black has difficulty in getting through their usual typical counterplay with f5. Therefore, my opponent was trying to activate his queen, which is, I don't know, probably a doubtful idea. I played a5, proceeding with my plan. Queen came to d4, and here I played a6, accomplishing my goal. My opponent took the pawn. Let's see for a moment what would happen if my opponent instead captures my knight on c3. I would capture on b7, rook moves to b8, and now I play knight c6, forking black's queen and rook on b8, and after black takes, I connect my pawns on the b and c files, and black is in very serious trouble, because those pawns will become a queen very soon. Going back to the game position after the 20th move a6, if my opponent takes my other knight with the queen, then I can simply take the pawn on b7 and fork two of black's rooks. In the game black played pawn takes on a6, allowing my knight to jump in to c6, which was my dream. Now the black queen is under attack, and also I'm threatening with a fork to give on e7 with my knight. Therefore, black had no choice but to take my knight, and now I got a beautiful protected passed pawn on c6. Black is in a very difficult position. I'll show you how the game ended. Knight c7 protected the pawn on a6. Rook a4 attacking the queen. Queen b6, and now a fine move, queen a1, getting space for my rook to get to b1. The black queen has barely any moves. It's about to get trapped. So black had no other choice than moving the knight away and giving up on the a6 pawn. Queen back to d8, and now I simply brought my other rook to the b file, f5, and rook takes pawn, knight hf6, bishop e3, rook captured, queen captured. Just a few more moves, so I'll show you the rest of it. Knight c7, and now pinning the knight once and using the pin a second time. And after rook b8, I can already play bishop takes c7, capturing the knight. Knight captures, and I can even sacrifice my queen and play knight takes c7, and my opponent resigned, because after rook takes queen, the pawn will become promoted, because the queen can stop it only temporarily, as knight a6 will chase the queen out. This was a very typical example of a good execution of a queenside play against the King's Indian, where I managed to get to the c6 square and the b file and the a file with my heavy pieces. Our following example is one of the most famous chess games ever played, between two former world champions, Mikhail Botvinnik and José Raúl Capablanca.
As I'm looking at the game right here, in this position, I see that both sides seems to be doing fine. Black has a little bit of better space advantage, and I would say that for a normal average chess player, they would probably analyze this as a little bit better position for black. So could you tell me please the plan for both sides, what black's supposed to do and what's white supposed to do here in this position?
Yes, this is a very complex position. White has a horrible bishop, for now at least, buried behind the wall of pawns on c3 and d4. Black has space advantage, and black is likely to win white's a pawn. I'm going to show you now what are the plans briefly, and then we'll see how Botvinnik continued here. The general plan for white is to play f3, knight g3, e4, and then advance with the e and f pawns and create an attack against black's king. At the same time, black's plan is to implant a knight through c6, a5 on b3, win this pawn, and then march up the a and the b pawns and maybe make a queen out of them. So it's really a race who gets there first. Let's see what happened in the game. It was black to move, actually. Black played knight c6, and white continued with knight g3. Came knight a5. Now, if black would have played knight e4 to trade knights, white's best response is a very surprising move, moving the knight back all the way to the corner. Because when we attack, as I said before, it's preferable not to trade pieces, but to maintain as much of our army as possible for the attack. And the idea is, again, kick the knight out next and come back with our knight. So in the game, black played knight a5, proceeding with the plan. And so did white. f3, knight b3, and e4. And now black got the pawn that he was looking for with queen takes a4. But so did white. White accomplished his plan of getting the pawns through to e5. Now black needs to waste a move, moving his knight away from the attack. Knight d7. Now this is an interesting moment, because black has a tricky threat. And that is to get his knight from b3 back to the game with a tricky move, knight b to c5. White cannot capture that knight because the queen on c2 would be unprotected. And if white captures the queen on a4, the black knight can recapture. Therefore, white had to take care of this problem and moved his queen closer to the king's side, queen to f2. The next part of the plan is to advance the f-pawn, or at times play knight f5, d6, if allowed. Black played g6, stopping the white knight from getting there. However, this further weakens black's king side. As we said, now white proceeds with f4. Now it would be very dangerous to allow the pawn to get to f6, and then a possible checkmate threat with queen getting to g7. So black had nothing better than to play f5. Now the situation would be reasonable for black if black would manage to get a knight here to e6 to block up the position. However, it's white to move, and white has a special move here that sometimes beginners forget. En passant, taking the pawn on f6. Knight takes back on f6, and now white is ready to open up the position against the black king with f5. Black took, exchanged the rooks, and the rook took back, and black came to rook e8, trying to trade the second pair of rooks. White didn't mind trading, however, not where black wants to trade, but by playing rook e6. Now, if black does not trade the rooks, but protects the knight with the king, Botvinnik planned to sacrifice the rook on f6, king take, and pawn takes on g6, giving a discovered check. And now, for example, if king g6, then queen f5, king g7, knight h5. If the king goes down, then the checkmate comes real quick. So the king better off goes to h6. When white plays h4, threatening checkmate with queen g5, rook protects with rook g8, and now g4 comes, queen c6, and bishop a3, and the bishop appears on f8, and white is winning again. In the game after white played rook e6, black did trade the rooks. White recaptured, and making a discovered attack on the black knight on f6, which black protected by king g7. If the black knight would have moved, that would allow the white queen to come in and checkmate in just 2 moves. Therefore, king g7 was necessary, and now the white queen comes in from f4. The threat is to play knight f5, takes queen g5, and white checkmates in a few moves. Also, the queen is eyeing to get in maybe to c7 in some variations. The game continued with queen e8 and queen e5, making a pin on the black knight, and queen e7. And this is one of the most famous combinations ever played. This is how the game ended. Bishop a3, sacrificing the bishop, luring the queen away from under the pawn and near the defense of the black king. Black accepted the sacrifice, not having much of a choice, and a second sacrifice, giving the knight up. Only the pawn can capture. Queen g5, king f8, queen f6. Now running towards the queen side, doesn't last long because checkmate in 2 comes. King has to go towards the king side corner, and now e7. So the pawn is about to get promoted. Also, white is threatening the checkmate with queen f8. Black's only hope is to give perpetual checks. Let's see if it works. Queen c1, king f2, king c2, king g3, queen d3, king h4, queen e4, king h5, queen e2, king h4, queen e4, and finally g4. Blocks the check, and one last check, queen e1, king h5, and black resigned because They have no defense against the upcoming checkmate on f8, except, of course, giving the queen up. In the example that we just saw, the average player would think that black was better. Black had space advantage, white had a weak a4 pawn, and a horrible bishop on b2. However, as we saw, the former world champion Mikhail Botvinnik created an ingenious plan by getting through the advance of the e-pawn and then creating a very, very dangerous attack against the black king. Try to remember this. This position arose from the Nimzo Indian and is very typical from that opening. The next position is a game between two world champions. White is Vasily Smyslov, former world champion, and his opponent with black, Garry Kasparov, although at that time he was not yet a world champion. This game is played back in 1981.
In this position, white is an exchange up. However, black has a pair of bishop, and white has a very big weakness on the light square diagonal from h1 to a8. So Susan, could you please explain to us what's black's plan to compensate for this, material disadvantage, and what kind of a plan can black create, to have compensation for this exchange?
Paul, you pinpointed the problem in white's position, and those are the light squares, especially around the white king. Black has a beautiful bishop sitting on f3, and even the black queen is kind of helping it from behind. However, beautiful is not enough. Black needs to materialize the attack. Otherwise, eventually, white will open the position and use his material advantage. The plan here is, if a queen could fly and get to h3 in one move, that would be really nice. However, obviously, that's not possible. However, the queen can get there in 4 moves. Let's see how Kasparov did it. So the dream is to get the queen to the king's side and then get also the rook out here and checkmate. Pure and simple, typical Kasparov style. So he played queen to c8. Now white could have defended better than he did. He played queen c3. Perhaps better tries were bishop c3 or maybe even the immediate b4 to get counterplay going in the middle of the board. After queen c3, Kasparov continued with rook f3, creating a simple attack because the target is the white king. a3, that's again too slow. In this type of position there is no time to waste. You better hurry up before a checkmate comes. Queen e8, and white took on c5. Now this a little bit slows down black's plan of the rook coming to h6 because a checkmate would come from g7. I guess that was Vasily Smyslov's plan. But Garry does not waste time taking back on c5 at this point, but plays the winning move, queen h5. This creates an immediate threat. For example, if white would proceed grabbing pawns by taking on d6, black can give checkmate in 3 moves. I'm sure if you pause for a moment, you can figure out how. The correct answer is here. Queen takes, king takes, rook check, king g1, and rook h1. Therefore, of course, white did not take the pawn on d6, but played h4, the only move that prevents the above combination. And now the queen comes in, sneaking in through g4. The strat is again getting to h3. White has to stop that by playing king h2, and now black can breed and take the pawn back for the moment. The plan is simple: get the rook around and destroy white's defense near the king. White got the rook to h1, willingly giving it up for the bishop, because even if in that case, after bishop takes, king takes, at least it's equal material, and black's most dangerous piece, that bishop on f3, is gone. However, Garry wants more than just equalize the material balance on the board. Rook g6 came, opening the diagonal of the bishop. Now black is threatening to take. king went to g1, and nevertheless the bishop can take, because after rook takes, queen can take, using the pin along the g-file. Black's next plan is to destroy the defense in front of the white king by capturing bishop to g3. White played queen a5, hoping for perpetual checks in case bishop takes. The check comes from d8, and it's perpetual. However, Kasparov made just one preventive move, making space for the king to escape and hide on h7, and after that Smyslov resigned because he cannot stop the upcoming sacrifice on g3. What did we see in this game? White was up an exchange, and yet lost. Why was that? Black created the right plan, understood what's the weakness in white's position, the light squares, and got all the pieces near the white king to develop a successful attack. What did we learn from here? Formulate the right plans based on what are the weaknesses in the opponent's position. What did white do wrong? White could have done better, not wasting several moves on the queen's side that were too slow. Planning is one of the most important things in chess. You formulate short-term and long-term plans. It will help you play better. I hope these examples that we went through in this segment will help you do better formulating plans and have better results. Good luck!